Aldrics Unseen Power.
France, 1918.
Nurse Evelyn Carter leaned over Captain James Calloway, changing his bandages as he drifted in and out of fevered dreams. Then suddenly he grabbed her wrist, his grip iron tight. His eyes, unfocused, locked onto hers. "Evelyn," he rasped. "Don't let them send me back." But how did he know her name? She had never told him. Chapter 1. A familiar stranger's plea. The air in the field hospital was thick with the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, overlaid with the coppery tang of blood and the ever-present scent of damp earth. Rain lashed against the canvas roof, a relentless drumming that mirrored the frantic rhythm of Evelyn Carter's heart. Another convoy had arrived, bringing with it a fresh wave of broken bodies from the front. She moved through the rows of cots, a blur of white linen and weary determination, her hands stained crimson, her back aching with a constant bending and lifting. She paused beside a new arrival, a captain, judging by the tattered remnants of his uniform. His face was pale, almost translucent, framed by dark, mud-caked hair. A deep gash ran across his forehead, partially obscured by a hastily applied bandage. He was young, she realized, younger than he had any right to be carrying such weight of command, such weight of suffering. His chest rose and fell shallowly, a ragged, uneven rhythm. Evelyn reached for a clean cloth, dipping it into a basin of lukewarm water. Gently, she began to cleanse the wound, her touch light and practiced. The captain stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes of a startling, clear gray, clouded with pain and fever. He mumbled something, unintelligible words lost in the cacophony of the hospital. As she worked, carefully removing the dried blood and debris from the wound, Evelyn felt a prickle of unease. There was something familiar about him. Not a familiarity of features, but a deeper, more instinctive recognition. She dismissed it as fatigue. She saw so many faces, so much suffering, that they often blurred together, forming a composite portrait of war's relentless toll. Suddenly, his hand shot out, his fingers closing around her wrist with surprising strength. Evelyn gasped, startled by the sudden movement. His grip was iron tight, the pressure almost painful. His eyes, still unfocused, locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice hoarse and strained. The sound of her name, spoken with such unexpected familiarity, sent a jolt of confusion through her. She didn't know this man. She was certain of it. Don't let them send me back." His voice was barely a whisper, a desperate plea that clawed at her heart. "Please, Evelyn," but how did he know her name? She had never told him. She hadn't told anyone in this chaotic, makeshift hospital, where names were often lost in the shuffle of casualties, where identities were reduced to injuries and bed numbers. She used only her surname, Nurse Carter, maintaining a professional distance, a necessary shield against the overwhelming tide of human misery. She tried to gently pry his fingers loose, but his grip remained firm. "Captain," she said, her voice calm and reassuring, despite the tremor of unease that ran through her. "You're safe here. You're in the hospital." His eyes, still fixed on hers, seemed to flicker with a strange recognition, a momentary clarity that pierced through the haze of fever. Then, just as quickly, the light faded, replaced by a vacant, unfocused stare. His grip loosened, his hand falling limply back onto the cot. He slipped back into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and uneven. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, her wrist throbbing where he had held her. The rain continued to batter the canvas roof, a relentless, mournful sound. She looked down at the captain, at his pale face, his closed eyes. The unsettling familiarity remained, a nagging question mark in the back of her mind. Who was this man? And how did he know her name? It felt more like a forgotten memory than a new one. She finished cleaning his wound, applying a fresh bandage with practiced efficiency. Her mind, however, was racing. His plea, "Don't let them send me back," echoed in her ears. It was a common enough sentiment among the soldiers. The trenches were a hell on earth, a place of unimaginable horror and suffering.
No one wanted to return to that.
But there had been something more in his voice, a specific, personal urgency that went beyond the general fear of the battlefield. It was as if he knew her, trusted her, was relying on her for something specific, something beyond the usual duties of a nurse. Something incredibly important. She glanced at his identification tags, half buried in the mud and blood that stained his uniform. Captain James Calloway. The name meant nothing to her. She had never met a Captain Calloway before. Or had she? A flicker of doubt, a whisper of a memory, brushed the edges of her consciousness. She moved on to the next patient, forcing herself to focus on the immediate needs of the wounded. But the captain's words, his desperate plea, and the unsettling mystery of how he knew her name, lingered in her mind, a persistent, unsettling undercurrent beneath the surface of her professional composure. It was a secret, whispered in a fevered dream, and it felt dangerously important. She finished her rounds, her body aching with exhaustion, her mind buzzing with unanswered questions. As she walked towards the small, makeshift nurse's quarters, she glanced back at the captain's cot. He was still unconscious, his face pale and still in the flickering lamplight. The mystery of his identity, of his connection to her, felt like a heavy weight in her pocket, a secret she was now burdened with, a secret she knew, instinctively, she had to unravel. The weight of his hand still clung to her wrist, a phantom limb that threatened a deep sense of dread. She needed to get to the bottom of this. She had to. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Field Hospital. The nurses' quarters were a small, cramped space, barely more than a partitioned-off corner of the storage tent. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and the lingering scent of carbolic acid. 3 narrow cots were lined up against one wall, each covered with a thin, gray blanket. A single, flickering oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows, illuminating the weary faces of the other 2 nurses already present. Margaret, a stout, middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, looked up from her mending. "Another rough night, Evelyn?" she asked, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. Evelyn nodded, sinking onto her cot with a sigh. The convoy was bad. So many young ones. She couldn't shake the image of Captain Calloway's face, his pale skin, his desperate eyes. "They're all young ones, these days," Elsie, the other nurse, murmured. She was younger than Evelyn, barely out of her teens, her face still carrying a trace of youthful innocence despite the horrors she had witnessed. "It's a never-ending stream of them." Evelyn rubbed her temples, trying to ease the throbbing headache that had taken root. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the unsettling familiarity of the captain's face, the mystery of how he knew her name. "There was one a captain," she began, hesitantly.
He knew my name.
Margaret looked up, her eyebrows raised. "Knew your name?"
How?
Evelyn recounted the incident, describing the captain's fevered state, his desperate plea, his iron grip on her wrist. "I've never seen him before," she insisted. "I'm sure of it. But he said my name, Evelyn, as if he knew me." Elsie shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her. "Perhaps it was the fever," she suggested. "They often say strange things, delirious things." "Perhaps," Evelyn conceded. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just delirium. There had been a clarity in his eyes, a momentary recognition that belied the fever's haze. Margaret, ever practical, dismissed the incident with a wave of her hand. "Don't let it trouble you, Evelyn. You've been working tirelessly. You're exhausted. It's probably just a coincidence." But Evelyn couldn't dismiss it so easily. The captain's words, his desperate plea, had struck a chord within her, a deep, unsettling resonance that she couldn't ignore. It was a mystery, and she felt compelled to solve it. Later that night, after Margaret and Elsie had fallen asleep, Evelyn lay awake, staring up at the canvas ceiling. The rain had stopped, and the only sound was the distant rumble of artillery fire, a constant reminder of the war that raged just beyond the relative safety of the hospital. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb her sleeping companions. She grabbed a small, battery-powered lamp and slipped out of the quarters, making her way back to the main ward. The hospital was quieter now, the frantic activity of the earlier evening replaced by a hushed, almost eerie stillness. The only sounds were the soft moans of the wounded, the occasional cough, the rhythmic drip of water from a leaky section of the canvas roof. She found Captain Calloway's cot easily. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. She stood beside him, holding the lamp aloft, studying his face in the dim light. There was a vulnerability about him in sleep, a boyishness that belied the harsh realities of his profession. She noticed a small, silver locket lying on his chest, partially hidden beneath the bandages. It was a simple, oval-shaped locket, tarnished with age and wear. On an impulse, she reached out and gently picked up the locket. It felt cool and smooth against her skin. She hesitated for a moment, feeling a pang of guilt at invading his privacy. But the urge to know more, to understand the connection she felt to this man, was too strong to resist. She carefully opened the locket. Inside, there were 2 miniature portraits. One was of a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, a woman she didn't recognize. The other sent a jolt of shock through her. It was a picture of herself. A younger version of herself, perhaps, but unmistakably her. She was wearing a white dress, her hair adorned with flowers, a smile gracing her lips. It was a picture she remembered, taken years ago, before the war, before everything had changed. She stared at the picture, her mind reeling. How did this man, this stranger, have a picture of her in his locket? What was the connection? The questions swirled in her mind, a dizzying vortex of confusion and disbelief. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. She quickly closed the locket, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to see a young orderly, his face pale and drawn, standing in the doorway. "Nurse Carter?" he said, his voice hesitant. There's been a message. For you." He held out a crumpled piece of paper, his hand trembling slightly. Evelyn took the message, her fingers fumbling with the paper. It was a telegram, addressed to her, from her brother, Thomas. Thomas was a soldier, stationed somewhere on the front lines. She hadn't heard from him in months. She unfolded the telegram, her hands shaking so badly she could barely read the words. The message was brief, stark, and devastating. "Regret to inform you Private Thomas Carter killed in action." The words blurred before her eyes. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she swayed, nearly collapsing. The orderly reached out to steady her, his face etched with concern. Evelyn didn't hear him. She didn't hear anything. The world seemed to shrink, to fade away, leaving only the crushing weight of grief, the unbearable pain of loss. Thomas was gone. Her brother, her only remaining family, was gone. She stumbled back to the nurse's quarters, the telegram clutched in her hand, the image of the locket, of her own face staring back at her from a stranger's possession, a distant, secondary concern in the face of this overwhelming tragedy. She had to find out how he got the picture. She needed to know. But first, she had to grieve. This changes everything. Chapter 3. The cipher in the locket. The next few days passed in a blur of grief and exhaustion. Evelyn moved through her duties mechanically, her mind numb, her heart a heavy ache in her chest. The news of Thomas's death had shattered her, leaving her feeling adrift and alone in a world that had suddenly become even more cruel and unforgiving. Margaret and Elsie did their best to comfort her, offering words of sympathy and taking on extra shifts to allow her time to rest. But nothing seemed to penetrate the fog of grief that enveloped her. She found herself staring blankly at the wall, replaying memories of Thomas, their childhood together, the letters they had exchanged, the promises they had made. The mystery of Captain Calloway and the locket, the unsettling familiarity she had felt, was pushed to the back of her mind, overshadowed by the immediate pain of her loss. But it lingered there, a persistent, nagging question that refused to be completely ignored. One evening, as she sat alone in the nurse's quarters, staring at the crumpled telegram, she remembered the locket. She had slipped it into her pocket after the orderly had brought the news of Thomas's death, and she hadn't looked at it since. She pulled it out, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface of the silver. It felt like a tangible link to the mystery, a clue to the puzzle that had been swirling in her mind. She opened it again, gazing at the two miniature portraits. The woman she didn't recognize, and herself, a younger, happier version of herself. As she stared at her own picture, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. There were tiny markings, almost invisible to the naked eye, etched into the back of the photograph, behind her image. She held the locket closer to the lamp, squinting to make out the markings. It was a cipher, a series of letters and numbers arranged in a seemingly random pattern. She recognized it instantly. It was a simple substitution cipher, one that she and Thomas had used as children to send secret messages to each other. They had called it their spy code, a childish game that had now taken on a chilling new significance. Her heart began to race. Why was their childhood cipher etched into the back of her picture, inside a locket belonging to a man she supposedly didn't know? What message did it contain? She grabbed a pencil and a scrap of paper, her hands trembling with anticipation. She carefully copied down the cipher, her mind racing to recall the key, the substitution table they had used all those years ago. It took her several minutes, her memory jogged by fragments of childhood games, whispered secrets in the dead of night. Finally, she had it.
The key.
She began to decipher the message, her pencil flying across the paper. As the letters and numbers began to form words, a chilling realization dawned on her. The message read, Amiens. August 12th, beware the raven.
Amiens.
It was a city, a strategic location on the front lines. August 12th. That was tomorrow. Beware the raven. What did it mean? Who was the raven? A sense of dread washed over her. This was no longer just a personal mystery. This was something bigger, something connected to the war, to the constant struggle for survival that raged just beyond the walls of the hospital. She looked at the picture of the other woman in the locket, the woman with the laughing eyes.
Who was she?
What was her connection to Captain Calloway, to the cipher, to the message? She knew she had to find out. She had to understand what was happening, what the message meant, and what role Captain Calloway played in all of this. He was still unconscious, still hovering between life and death. But she had a feeling, a deep, instinctive certainty, that he held the key to unraveling this mystery. She closed the locket, her fingers tightening around it. The grief for Thomas was still there, a raw, aching wound. But now, there was something else, a sense of urgency, a need to act, to uncover the truth, to prevent whatever tragedy the message was warning of. She had to talk to someone she could trust. But who? In this world of shifting alliances, of spies and secrets, of hidden agendas, who could she turn to? The answer, when it came, was both surprising and, in a strange way, inevitable. It was the only person who might be able to decipher the meaning and the danger behind the raven. She had to speak to Major Davies, the intelligence officer, and not a moment too soon. Time was running out. Chapter 4. Shadows of Amiens. Major Alistair Davies was a man who seemed to blend into the background, a nondescript figure in a sea of khaki uniforms. He was of medium height and build, with thinning brown hair and unremarkable features. But his eyes, a sharp, penetrating gray, held a keen intelligence, a watchful alertness that missed nothing. He was the intelligence officer attached to the medical unit, responsible for gathering information, debriefing soldiers, and, it was rumored, running a network of informants. Evelyn found him in his makeshift office, a small, cluttered room at the back of the supply tent. He was poring over maps, his brow furrowed in concentration. The room smelled of stale tobacco and damp paper. "Nurse Carter," he said, looking up as she entered. His voice was calm, almost neutral, but his eyes held a questioning glint. "What can I do for you?" Evelyn hesitated, unsure how to begin. She had never spoken to Major Davies before, except for a brief, formal introduction when she had first arrived at the hospital. She knew his reputation, though. He was known for his discretion, his ruthlessness, and his unwavering loyalty to the cause. She took a deep breath and plunged in. "Major, I need to speak to you. It's about Captain Calloway." Davies's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Captain Calloway? He's still unconscious, isn't he?" "Yes, sir. But I found something. Something that I believe is important." She recounted the story, starting with the captain's fevered plea, his knowledge of her name, the discovery of the locket, and finally, the ciphered message. She held out the locket, open to the two portraits, showing him the tiny markings on the back of her photograph. Davies took the locket, examining it closely. He held it up to the light, his eyes narrowed, studying the cipher. He listened intently as she explained how she had deciphered it, the message it contained. Amiens. August 12th. Beware the Raven. He sat back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. "Amiens," he murmured. "That's concerning. There's a major offensive planned for tomorrow, a push to break through the German lines." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. The message, the timing, it all pointed to something sinister, a threat to the planned offensive. "The Raven," Davies continued, his voice low and thoughtful. "That's a code name. I've heard it before, whispered in intelligence circles. It refers to a German spy, a highly placed operative with access to sensitive information." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. A German spy. And Captain Calloway, somehow, was connected to this spy, to this threat. But why would Captain Calloway have this message? She asked. Why would he have a picture of me with this cipher? Davies shook his head. That's what we need to find out. He's clearly involved somehow. But is he a victim, a messenger, or something else? He looked at Evelyn, his gaze intense. You said he knew your name, even before you told him? Evelyn nodded. Yes, sir. It was strange. As if he recognized me. Davies leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Nurse Carter, I need you to think very carefully. Have you ever met Captain Calloway before? Even briefly? Before the war, perhaps? Evelyn searched her memory, desperately trying to recall any encounter, any fleeting glimpse of the captain's face. The unsettling familiarity she had felt, could it be more than just a coincidence? Suddenly, a fragmented memory surfaced, a brief, almost forgotten encounter from years ago. A summer evening, a garden party, a young officer in uniform, a fleeting conversation, a shared laugh, a brief moment of connection. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. I think I did. Years ago. Before the war. It was just a brief meeting. I barely remember it. Davies nodded, his eyes gleaming with understanding. That explains the picture, perhaps. But it doesn't explain the cipher, the message. He must have known you would be here, that you would find it. But why me? Evelyn asked, her voice filled with confusion. Why would he send this message to me? Because he trusted you, Davies said. For some reason, he believed you were the only one who could decipher the message, the only one who could warn us. He paused, his gaze hardening. Or perhaps he was setting you up, making you the fall guy. Evelyn's mind reeled. The possibility that Captain Calloway, the man who had seemed so vulnerable, so desperate, might be using her, manipulating her, was a chilling thought. We need to find out the truth, Davies said, his voice firm. And we need to do it quickly. Tomorrow is August 12th. The offensive is about to begin. If the Raven has compromised our plans, the consequences could be catastrophic. He stood up, his eyes fixed on Evelyn. Nurse Carter, I need your help. Will you work with me to uncover the truth about Captain Calloway and to stop the Raven? He needs answers and he needs her. This could be a trap. But she knows she must act. Chapter 5. A stolen kiss before dawn. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. Major Davies's request, his stark assessment of the situation, had left her breathless. She was a nurse, not a spy. Her world was one of bandages and medicine, of comforting the wounded and easing their pain. Not of ciphers and code names, of espionage and betrayal. But she couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. The lives of countless soldiers, perhaps the outcome of the entire offensive, hung in the balance. And Captain Calloway, the man who had whispered her name in his fevered dreams, the man who held a picture of her in his locket, was at the center of it all. Yes, Major, she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. I'll help you. I have to. Davies nodded, a flicker of approval in his eyes.
Good.
We don't have much time. The offensive begins at dawn. He outlined a plan, a risky, desperate gamble to uncover the truth and prevent the Raven from sabotaging the attack. Evelyn was to return to Captain Calloway's bedside, to watch him, to listen for any clues, any indication of his true intentions. Davies would arrange for a subtle surveillance of the area, a discreet watch on anyone who approached the captain's cot. He may regain consciousness, Davies said. If he does, try to get him to talk. See if you can get him to reveal anything about the Raven, about the message. Evelyn nodded, her mind racing. It was a dangerous game, a delicate dance between trust and deception. She was to play the role of the concerned nurse, while secretly probing for information, searching for answers in the words and actions of a man who might be her enemy. As she walked back to the main ward, the first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky with streaks of pale gray and pink. The hospital was stirring, the sounds of morning activity replacing the hushed stillness of the night. She found Captain Calloway still unconscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. She sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, monitoring his pulse. She studied his face, searching for any sign of change, any flicker of awareness. Hours passed, and the hospital buzzed with activity around them. The sounds of the impending offensive grew louder, the distant rumble of artillery fire, the shouts of orders, the rumble of trucks and tanks moving into position. Suddenly, his eyelids fluttered. He stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes, still clouded with confusion, slowly focused on her. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice weak and strained. She leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Captain Calloway? Can you hear me?" He nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on hers. He seemed to recognize her, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. You found it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "The message, yes," she said, her voice calm and reassuring, despite the racing of her heart. "I found the message."
Mian.
August 12th. Beware the Raven. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of alarm in their depths. "You deciphered it?" "Yes," she said. "I did. What does it mean, Captain? Who is the Raven?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting, his brow furrowing in concentration. He seemed to be struggling to remember, to piece together fragmented memories. "The Raven a spy," he whispered. He has information. About the offensive, what information? Evelyn pressed, her voice urgent. "What does he know?" He shook his head, his eyes filled with pain and confusion. I can't remember. It's all a blur. But you have to stop him. He's going to betray us." He reached out, his hand grasping hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "Evelyn, you have to trust me. I didn't want this. I was forced." His words, his desperate plea, rang with sincerity. But Evelyn couldn't be sure. Was he telling the truth? Or was he playing her, manipulating her, as Davies had suggested? Suddenly, he pulled her closer, his eyes locking onto hers. Before she could react, he leaned in and kissed her, a brief, desperate, surprisingly tender kiss. It was a stolen moment, a fleeting connection in the midst of chaos and uncertainty. Evelyn was stunned, her mind reeling. The kiss, the unexpected intimacy, had caught her off guard. It was a mixture of desperation and longing, a spark of connection in a world consumed by war. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers, a question in their depths. "Evelyn," he whispered, "please believe me." Before she could respond, a commotion erupted nearby. Shouts, the sound of running footsteps, the clatter of equipment. Davies's men, moving swiftly and silently, were surrounding the cot. A figure, a man in a doctor's coat, was struggling against their grip. Evelyn recognized him. It was Dr. Moreau, one of the surgeons attached to the medical unit. He was a quiet, unassuming man, known for his skill and dedication. But now, his face was contorted with rage and fear. "The Raven," Davies said, his voice cold and hard. "We've found him." Dr. Moreau, the Raven, had been listening. And now, everything was about to change. Chapter 6. The Interrogation. The scene unfolded with shocking speed. Dr. Moreau, wrestled to the ground by Davies's men, was quickly disarmed and bound. His eyes, filled with a mixture of defiance and terror, darted around the room, finally settling on Evelyn. There was a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, accusation, perhaps, or even a twisted sort of understanding. Captain Calloway, roused by the commotion, struggled to sit up, his face a mask of confusion and pain. What's happening?" he asked, his voice weak and strained. Davies ignored him, his attention focused solely on Moreau. "Take him to the interrogation room," he ordered his men, "and keep him under guard. No one goes in or out without my authorization." The interrogation room was a small, windowless storage room at the back of the supply tent, hastily converted for its new purpose. The air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. A single, bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows on the walls. Davies stood before Moreau, his face grim, his eyes cold. Evelyn stood beside him, a silent observer, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She had played her part, unwittingly leading them to the Raven. But the danger was far from over. "Dr. Moreau," Davies began, his voice low and menacing. "Or should I say Herr Schmidt?" Moreau or Schmidt flinched, his eyes widening in surprise. The name, spoken in German, revealed his true identity, his hidden allegiance. "You have been posing as a doctor, using your position to gather information, to sabotage our efforts," Davies continued. "You are the Raven, and we have proof." Schmidt remained silent, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes defiant. He knew that he had the power to change the course of the battle, and perhaps even the war. Davies produced a small, leather-bound notebook, recovered from Schmidt's belongings.
"This is your codebook," he said.
"We found it hidden in your quarters. It contains details of our troop movements, our supply lines, our planned offensive." He opened the notebook, showing Schmidt the pages filled with coded messages, intricate diagrams, and detailed plans. Schmidt's face paled, his defiance crumbling. "We also intercepted your transmissions," Davies continued. "We know you have been communicating with your superiors in the German High Command. You have betrayed your oath, your profession, and your adopted country." Schmidt finally spoke, his voice trembling.
I had no choice," he said.
They threaten my family, my wife, my children. They are still in Germany." Davies remained unmoved. "That is no excuse. You have endangered the lives of countless soldiers on both sides. You have aided the enemy in a time of war." Evelyn watched the interrogation unfold, her mind reeling. The quiet, unassuming Dr. Moreau, a man she had worked alongside, a man she had trusted, was a German spy. The revelation was shocking, a stark reminder of the hidden dangers, the pervasive deceit that permeated this war. She thought of Captain Calloway, his desperate plea, his stolen kiss. Was he truly a victim, as he claimed? Or was he somehow complicit in Schmidt's treachery? She didn't know, but she was determined to find out. The interrogation continued for hours, Davies relentlessly grilling Schmidt, extracting every detail of his espionage activities, his network of contacts, his plans to sabotage the offensive. Schmidt, realizing that his game was up, began to cooperate, revealing the full extent of his treachery. He confirmed that he had been feeding information to the German High Command, providing them with crucial details of the planned attack. He had intended to signal the German artillery, using a pre-arranged code, to target the Allied troop concentrations, causing maximum casualties and disrupting the offensive. As the interrogation drew to a close, Davies turned to Evelyn. "Nurse Carter," he said, "I believe you have some questions for Captain Calloway." Evelyn nodded, her heart pounding. It was time to confront the captain, to uncover the truth about his involvement, his connection to the Raven, and the mystery of the locket. She needed to find out where his loyalties truly lay. Her safety and the safety of so many others depended on it. The answers were close. She could feel it. Chapter 7. Letters from a Ghost. Captain Calloway lay pale and weak in his cot, the commotion of the morning's events having taken a toll on his fragile health. He watched Evelyn approach, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The events following the apprehension of Dr. Moreau had been swift, blurring into a confused haze for him. "Evelyn," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "What happened?"
They took Dr. Moreau. They said he was a spy."
Evelyn sat beside him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "He was Captain. He was the Raven. The one your message warned about." Calloway's eyes widened slightly. You understood the message? You saved the offensive?" "We saved it," Evelyn corrected. "Major Davies and I. Thanks to your message." She paused, her gaze searching his. "But there are still unanswered questions, Captain. Questions that only you can answer." He looked at her, his expression guarded. "What questions?" "The locket," Evelyn said, her voice low and direct. "The picture of me. The cipher. Why did you have it? Why did you send that message to me?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He seemed to be struggling with his memories, with the pain of his injuries, with the weight of his secrets. "The locket, it was given to me," he said finally, his voice barely audible. By the woman in the other picture. Her name was Annalise." Evelyn remembered the woman in the locket, the one with the dark hair and laughing eyes.
"Who is she?"
"She was my fiancée," Calloway said, his voice catching with emotion. "We were to be married before the war." He recounted the story, his voice halting and fragmented, punctuated by long pauses as he struggled to recall the details. He and Annalise had met in Germany before the war, during a brief visit he had made with his family. They had fallen in love, a whirlwind romance that had blossomed amidst the growing tensions between their two countries. "She gave me the locket," he said, "with her picture and yours.
She knew you.
From that garden party years ago. You made an impression on her. She told me that if anything ever happened to us, that if we were ever separated, that I should seek you." "But why the cipher?" Evelyn asked. "Why the secret message?" "Annalise, she was involved in something," Calloway said, his voice hesitant. "Something dangerous. She was working against the German war effort, providing information to the Allies. The Raven, he was her contact. But she discovered that he was a double agent, that he was betraying them, feeding false information to both sides. She learned of the planned attack on Amiens," he continued. "She knew the Raven intended to sabotage it. She had to warn the Allies. But she couldn't risk sending a direct message. It was too dangerous. She gave the locket with the coded information to me. She told me to find you," he said, his gaze meeting Evelyn's. "She said you were intelligent, resourceful, that you could be trusted. She said you were the only one who could decipher the message, the only one who could stop the Raven." He reached out, his hand weakly grasping hers. I didn't know what to do. I was captured, wounded, I thought I was going to die. I remembered your name from the locket, from Annalise's stories. I had to warn you." Evelyn listened to his story, her heart aching with the weight of his words, the tragedy of his lost love, the burden of his secret. She believed him. She could see the truth in his eyes, the sincerity in his voice. "What happened to Annalise?" she asked softly. Calloway's eyes filled with tears. She was discovered," he said, his voice choked with emotion. They executed her. For treason." A wave of grief washed over Evelyn, a shared sorrow for a woman she had never met, a woman who had sacrificed everything for her beliefs, for her love. It was a connection forged in tragedy, a bond between two women, separated by war, united by a common cause. I have her letters," Calloway said, his voice barely a whisper. "Hidden in my belongings. They tell the whole story." Evelyn knew what she had to do. She had to find those letters, to uncover the full truth of Annalise's story, to honor her sacrifice, to ensure that her efforts had not been in vain. The letters were the last piece. They held the truth. She rose from his bedside to retrieve them, to keep them safe, to bear witness to the bravery of a ghost. Chapter 8. The Spy Among Us. Major Davies arranged for Captain Calloway's belongings to be brought to Evelyn. They were contained in a small, battered leather satchel, stained with mud and blood, a testament to the harsh realities of trench warfare. The satchel contained a few personal items, A worn photograph of Calloway's family, a tattered book of poetry, a small, silver compass, and a packet of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. Evelyn recognized the ribbon. It was the same color as the flowers that had adorned her hair in the photograph in the locket, a pale, delicate lavender. It was a small detail, but it resonated with her, a tangible link to Annalise, to the woman who had entrusted her with this secret. She carefully untied the ribbon, her fingers trembling slightly. The letters were written in German, in a delicate, flowing script. She could read German, a skill she had acquired during her schooling, a skill that had now become unexpectedly crucial. She began to read, her eyes scanning the pages, her heart pounding with anticipation. The letters were a chronicle of Annalise's life, her love for Calloway, her growing disillusionment with the war, her decision to work against the German regime. Annalise wrote of her secret meetings with Allied agents, her daring exploits in gathering information, her constant fear of discovery. She described the Raven, her initial trust in him, her gradual realization that he was a double agent, his betrayal of her and her cause. The letters were filled with passion, with courage, with a deep, unwavering commitment to peace and justice. They were a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the resilience of love in the face of adversity. As Evelyn read, she began to piece together the full picture, the intricate web of espionage and betrayal that had ensnared Annalise and Calloway. She learned of the Raven's network of contacts, his methods of communication, his plans to sabotage the Allied offensive. But there was something else, something that caught Evelyn's attention, a detail that seemed out of place, a discrepancy that didn't quite fit. In one of the letters, Annalise mentioned a contact within the Allied forces, a person she referred to only as the Nightingale. She wrote of the Nightingale with suspicion, expressing her doubts about this person's true loyalty. She hinted that the Nightingale might be feeding information to the Raven, that this person might be a double agent, working for both sides. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. A double agent within the Allied forces? Could it be true? Who was the Nightingale? She reread the letter, searching for any clue, any hint of the Nightingale's identity. But Annalise had been careful, revealing nothing that could directly expose this person. She had been too cautious, too aware of the dangers of her work. Evelyn realized that this discovery changed everything. The Raven had been captured, but the threat was not over. There was still a spy among them, a hidden enemy who could still sabotage their efforts, who could still betray them. She knew she had to inform Major Davies, to share this new information with him. But a nagging doubt lingered in her mind. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone? The revelation of the Nightingale had cast a shadow of suspicion over everyone, even those she had considered her allies. The lines between friend and foe had become blurred, the boundaries of trust eroded by the pervasive deceit of war. She decided to conduct her own investigation, to discreetly gather information, to observe her colleagues, to search for any sign of suspicious behavior. She had to uncover the identity of the Nightingale, to expose this hidden enemy before it was too late. She started with the medical staff, the doctors, the nurses, the orderlies. She watched them closely, listening to their conversations, observing their interactions, searching for any clue, any indication of a hidden agenda. She noticed small things, subtle details that might have gone unnoticed before. A furtive glance, a whispered conversation, a nervous gesture, a fleeting expression of guilt or fear. She began to suspect someone, a person she had worked alongside, a person she had considered a friend. Nurse Elsie, the young, seemingly innocent nurse, who had always been so eager to help, so quick to comfort. Evelyn had noticed a change in Elsie's behavior in recent days. She had become withdrawn, secretive, avoiding Evelyn's gaze, answering her questions evasively. She had also been seen talking to Dr. Morrow. Before his arrest, a conversation that had seemed strained and uncomfortable. Evelyn decided to confront Elsie, to challenge her, to see if she could elicit a confession, a revelation of her true identity. She was walking the dangerous line. The war created monsters and revealed them. It was up to her to find this one before it was too late. Chapter 9. Beneath a Shattered Sky. The sky above the field hospital was a canvas of bruised purples and angry grays, mirroring the turmoil in Evelyn's heart. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and the distant rumble of artillery fire served as a constant, ominous reminder of the war's relentless presence. She found Elsie in the nurse's quarters, ostensibly sorting through a pile of linens, but her movements were jerky, and her eyes avoided Evelyn's. "Elsie," Evelyn began, her voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Elsie flinched, her hands stilling on the pile of sheets. "About what, Nurse Carter?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on the floor. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. "About Dr. Morrow. About the letters. About the Nightingale." Elsie's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice trembling. "Don't lie to me, Elsie," Evelyn said, her voice hardening. "I know you were talking to Morrow. I know you've been acting strangely. And I know about the Nightingale." She produced one of Annalise's letters, the one that mentioned the suspected double agent within the Allied forces. She held it out to Elsie, pointing to the passage where Annalise had expressed her doubts. Elsie stared at the letter, her face paling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. Annalise suspected the Nightingale was feeding information to the Raven. Evelyn continued, her voice relentless. That this person was working for both sides. "Was it you, Elsie? Were you the Nightingale?" Tears welled up in Elsie's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She shook her head, her body trembling. "No," she whispered. "No, it wasn't me."
I swear.
"Then, who was it?" Evelyn pressed. "Who was Morrow's contact? Who was betraying us?" Elsie hesitated, her gaze shifting, her lower lip trembling. She seemed to be struggling with a decision, torn between fear and loyalty. "I can't," she whispered.
I'm afraid.
"They'll kill me." "Who will kill you?" Evelyn asked, her voice softening slightly. "Tell me, Elsie. You can trust me." Elsie looked at Evelyn, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. It's Major Davies," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rumble of the approaching storm. Evelyn's heart stopped. Major Davies? The intelligence officer, the man she had trusted, the man she had worked with to capture the Raven? It couldn't be true. "Davies?" she said, her voice incredulous. That's impossible. He's the one who arrested Morrow." "He staged it," Elsie said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a desperate need to confess. "He knew we were on to Morrow. He had to get rid of him, to protect himself. Morrow was just a pawn, a sacrifice to cover his own tracks." She recounted the story, her words tumbling out in a rush, a torrent of fear and guilt. She had been recruited by Davies, she explained, seduced by his charm, his promises of a better life after the war. He had used her to gather information, to pass messages, to keep an eye on the other nurses, on Evelyn. "He knew about Captain Calloway," Elsie said. "He knew about the locket, the message. He was waiting for you to decipher it, to lead him to Morrow. He was playing both sides, Evelyn. He was working for the Germans all along." Evelyn's mind reeled. The pieces of the puzzle, the fragments of information, the nagging doubts, all began to fall into place. Davies's seemingly impeccable loyalty, his ruthless efficiency, his unwavering focus on the war effort, it had all been a carefully constructed facade, a mask to conceal his true allegiance. The stolen kiss, Calloway's warning, it all made a horrible, terrifying sense. The storm broke, unleashing a torrent of rain that lashed against the canvas roof of the tent. The sound was deafening, mirroring the chaos and turmoil in Evelyn's mind. She looked at Elsie, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and anger. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Because I can't live with it anymore," Elsie said, her voice choked with sobs. "The guilt, the fear, it's eating me alive. And I saw the way you looked at Captain Calloway. You care about him. I couldn't let Davies, I couldn't let him hurt you, hurt any more innocent people." Evelyn knew she had to act, and quickly. Davies was dangerous, a cunning and ruthless enemy who had infiltrated the very heart of their operations. He had to be stopped before he could do any more damage, before he could betray them all. The lives of so many rested on her shoulders, and the realization sent a shiver of ice down her spine. She was running out of time, and she knew exactly what she had to do. The offensive would begin soon. She needed to act before it was too late. Chapter 10. The Price of Loyalty. The rain continued to lash against the canvas, a relentless drumming that echoed the frantic beat of Evelyn's heart. Major Davies, a traitor, a double agent. The revelation was a devastating blow, a betrayal that shattered her trust and threatened to unravel everything she had fought for. She knew she couldn't confront Davies directly. He was too powerful, too cunning, and too well-connected. He would have anticipated her suspicions, prepared his defenses, and likely have her silenced before she could expose him. She needed proof, concrete evidence that would convince others of his treachery. She needed to find something that would definitively link him to the Germans, to the Raven, to the sabotage of the Allied offensive. She thought of Annelise's letters, the detailed accounts of her espionage activities, her contacts, her methods. There might be something there, a hidden clue, an overlooked detail that could expose Davies's true identity. She decided to return to Calloway's bedside. He was awake now, his condition slightly improved, his mind clearer. She needed his help, his knowledge of Annelise, his insights into the German intelligence network. She found him sitting up in his cot, his face pale, but his eyes alert. He looked at her, a question in his gaze. "Evelyn," he said, his voice stronger than before. "What is it? What's happened?" She sat beside him, her voice low and urgent. "Captain, I need your help. It's about Davies. He's not who we think he is." She recounted Elsie's confession, the revelation that Davies was the Nightingale, the double agent who had been working for the Germans all along. She explained her need for proof, her plan to search for evidence in Annelise's letters. Calloway listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Davies," he murmured. "I never trusted him. There was something about him that didn't feel right." He agreed to help her, offering his knowledge of Annelise's network, his understanding of German intelligence operations. They pored over the letters together, searching for any clue, any hint of Davies's involvement. As they read, they discovered a recurring symbol, a small, stylized raven, drawn in the margins of several letters. It was a subtle detail, easily overlooked, but it resonated with Calloway. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice excited. Annelise used it as a kind of signature, a mark to identify her contacts, her messages. He explained that the raven symbol was a secret code, a way for Annelise to authenticate her communications, to ensure that they were not intercepted or forged. "Davies must have known about this," Evelyn said. "He must have used it to communicate with the Germans, to identify himself as the Nightingale." They searched through Davies's office, discreetly, carefully, avoiding the watchful eyes of his men. They found nothing, no trace of the raven symbol, no evidence of his treachery. Just as they were about to give up, Evelyn noticed something, a small, almost imperceptible detail on Davies's desk. It was a paperweight, a seemingly innocuous object, made of dark, polished stone. She picked it up, examining it closely. And there, etched into the base of the paperweight, was the small, stylized raven. Her heart leaped. It was the proof she needed, the definitive link between Davies and the German intelligence network. She had found it. But just as she was about to show Calloway, the door to the office burst open. Major Davies stood there, his face a mask of cold fury, a pistol in his hand. "Looking for something, Nurse Carter?" he said, his voice dripping with menace. He had been watching them, anticipating their every move. Evelyn knew they were trapped. Davies had them cornered, and he wouldn't hesitate to use his weapon. The price of loyalty, she realized, was often paid in blood. And now, the moment of truth had arrived. She had to be resourceful. He had to be stopped. Chapter 11. A Desperate Escape. Davies advanced into the room, his pistol leveled at Evelyn. Calloway, still weak from his injuries, struggled to rise from his cot, his face a mixture of fear and determination. "I should have known," Davies said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You were always too clever for your own good, Nurse Carter. Too curious. Too sentimental." He gestured towards the paperweight in Evelyn's hand. "That's a nice piece, isn't it? A gift. From a friend."
In Berlin.
Evelyn stood her ground, her grip tightening on the paperweight. "You betrayed us, Davies," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You betrayed your country, your oath, your friends." Davies laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Sentimentality," he sneered. "It's a weakness, Nurse Carter. One that will be your undoing." He took another step closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this," he said. "But you leave me no choice." Suddenly, Calloway lunged from his cot, tackling Davies with surprising strength. The pistol fired, the bullet whizzing past Evelyn's head, embedding itself in the canvas wall of the tent. The two men grappled on the floor, a desperate struggle for control of the weapon. Calloway, despite his weakened condition, fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, fueled by his love for Annalise, his loyalty to his country, his desire for revenge. Evelyn seized the opportunity. She grabbed a heavy medical textbook from a nearby shelf and slammed it down on Davies' head with all her strength. Davies groaned, his grip on the pistol loosening. Calloway wrenched the weapon from his hand, pointing it at the dazed intelligence officer. "It's over, Davies," Calloway said, his voice hoarse and strained. "You're finished." Davies, his face bloodied, looked up at them, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and defeat. "You haven't won," he spat. "The offensive, it's already compromised. The Germans, they know everything." Evelyn knew he was right. Even with Davies captured, the threat remained. The Germans had been forewarned, their artillery poised to unleash a devastating barrage on the Allied troops. She had to warn them, to alert the command, to somehow prevent the impending slaughter. But how? Communication lines were likely monitored, compromised by Davies' treachery. She remembered the signal flares, used to communicate with troops on the front lines, to coordinate attacks, to mark positions. There was a supply of flares stored in the nearby ammunition depot. She had a desperate plan, a risky gamble that could save countless lives, or lead to her own capture and death. "Captain," she said, her voice urgent. "Cover Davies. I have to warn them." She slipped out of the office, leaving Calloway to guard the captured traitor. She raced towards the ammunition depot, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She reached the depot, finding it unguarded. The soldiers were busy preparing for the offensive, unaware of the impending danger. She grabbed a box of signal flares, a flare gun, and a handful of color cartridges. She knew the code, the specific sequence of colors used to signal a warning, to alert the troops of an impending artillery barrage. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. She climbed to the highest point she could find, a partially collapsed church tower overlooking the battlefield. From there, she could see the Allied troop concentrations, the trenches, the artillery positions. She loaded the flare gun, her hands trembling. She fired the first flare, a bright red burst that arced across the sky, a desperate plea for attention. She followed it with the second, a green flare, and then the third, a yellow flare. The warning signal. She repeated the sequence, again and again, sending a shower of colored lights into the pre-dawn sky. She prayed that someone would see them, that someone would understand the message, that someone would act before it was too late. Below, she saw movement, figures stirring in the trenches, officers shouting orders, soldiers scrambling for cover. The warning had been received. The element of surprise was lost, or so she hoped. But then, she heard the whistle of incoming shells, the deafening roar of explosions, the screams of the wounded. The German artillery had opened fire. The battle had begun. She had warned them. But was it enough? She watched, her eyes burning. It was all she could do. Chapter 12. The Safe House in Reims. The shelling was relentless, a terrifying barrage that shook the ground and filled the air with the acrid smell of cordite. Evelyn watched from the shattered church tower, her heart aching with the knowledge that, despite her efforts, many lives would still be lost. The warning had come late, but perhaps not too late to prevent a complete massacre. She knew she couldn't stay there. Davies's capture would be discovered soon, and the area would be swarming with soldiers, searching for her, for any remaining collaborators. She had to escape, to disappear, to find a safe haven where she could regroup and plan her next move. She remembered Annalise's letters, a mention of a safe house in Reims, a place used by Allied agents, a refuge for those on the run. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. She climbed down from the tower, her body bruised and aching, her clothes torn and covered in dust. She made her way through the chaotic scene of the battlefield, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the shadows, using her nurse's uniform as a disguise, a shield against suspicion. It took her hours, a perilous journey through a landscape ravaged by war. She walked, she ran, she hid, she begged for rides from passing trucks, offering her medical skills in exchange for transport. Finally, she reached Reims, a city battered but still standing, its streets filled with refugees, soldiers, and the ever-present fear of air raids and artillery fire. She found the address, a nondescript building in a quiet side street, its windows shuttered, its door unmarked. She knocked, using a specific pattern, a code she had memorized from Annalise's letters. 3 short knocks, a pause, 2 long knocks, a pause, 1 final short knock. The door opened a crack, revealing a wary eye, a woman's face, etched with suspicion. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice guarded, her hand resting on something concealed beneath her apron, likely a weapon. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said, her voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. I was sent by Annalise. By Captain Calloway." The woman's eyes narrowed, studying Evelyn's face, searching for any sign of deception. "Annalise is dead," she said, her voice flat. "I know," Evelyn said. "I have her letters. She told Captain Calloway to seek me out. She said this was a safe place." The woman hesitated, her gaze unwavering. She seemed to be weighing Evelyn's words, assessing the risk. "The password," the woman said. "What is the password?" Evelyn remembered the phrase, a seemingly innocuous sentence from one of Annalise's letters, a coded message that identified her as a trusted ally. "The lavender blooms in the spring," Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady. The woman's eyes flickered, a flicker of recognition. She opened the door wider, revealing a dimly lit hallway, a haven from the chaos outside. "Come in," the woman said, her voice softening slightly. "You are safe here." Evelyn stepped inside, her legs weak with relief. The door closed behind her, shutting out the noise and the danger of the war, enclosing her in a cocoon of relative safety. The woman introduced herself as Madame Dubois, a veteran of the French resistance, a seasoned operative who had been running the safe house for years. She provided Evelyn with food, water, a change of clothes, and a small, sparsely furnished room where she could rest. Evelyn told Madame Dubois her story, recounting the events of the past few days, the discovery of Davies's treachery, her desperate escape, her arrival in Reims. Madame Dubois listened intently, her expression grim, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "You have done well, Mademoiselle Carter," she said. "You have risked your life to save others. You are a brave woman." Evelyn shook her head. "I don't feel brave," she said. "I feel lost. And scared." "That is understandable," Madame Dubois said. "But you are not alone. We are all scared. But we must continue to fight. We must never give up hope." She placed a gentle hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "You rest for a while. The path forward will reveal itself." Evelyn knew she was right. The fight was far from over. Davies was captured, but his network likely remained, his influence still lingering. The war raged on, and she had a role to play, a duty to fulfill. But for now, she was safe. She was among friends, allies who shared her commitment to freedom, to justice, to a world without war. She had found a refuge, a place to heal, to regroup, to prepare for the battles that still lay ahead. The storm may have passed for now, but the sky was still far from clear. Chapter 13. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. Evelyn spent several days in the safe house, recovering from her ordeal, both physically and emotionally. Madame Dubois proved to be a kind and resourceful host, providing not only shelter and sustenance, but also a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. Evelyn learned more about the resistance, the network of brave men and women who risked their lives daily to fight the German occupation, to sabotage their efforts, to aid the Allied cause. She also spent time reflecting on her past, on the events that had led her to this point, on the choices she had made, the losses she had endured. The memories of Thomas, her brother, haunted her, a constant reminder of the personal cost of war. The image of Anneliese, the woman she had never met but whose life had become so intertwined with her own, filled her with a mixture of sadness and admiration. One evening, as she sat with Madame Dubois in the small, dimly lit common room of the safe house, she spoke of her past, of her life before the war, of the garden party where she had first met Captain Calloway, a fleeting encounter that had taken on such profound significance. "It was so long ago," she said, her voice wistful. "I barely remember it. It was just a brief conversation, a shared laugh, a moment of connection. I never thought I would see him again." Madame Dubois listened intently, her eyes filled with a knowing wisdom. "Sometimes," she said, "the smallest encounters, the briefest moments, can have the greatest impact on our lives. Fate, it seems, has a strange way of weaving its threads." Evelyn nodded, her gaze drifting towards the window, towards the darkened streets of Reims. "I keep thinking about Anneliese," she said, "about her courage, her sacrifice. She gave up everything for what she believed in. She was a true patriot," Madame Dubois said. "A hero. Her memory will live on, in the hearts of those who fight for freedom." "I wish I could have met her," Evelyn said. "I feel like I know her, through her letters, through Captain Calloway's stories. But it's not the same." Madame Dubois smiled sadly. "Sometimes we know people better through their words, through their actions, than we ever could in person. Their spirit, their essence, shines through, even in their absence." She reached into a small, wooden box, a treasure chest of mementos, of secrets, of memories. She pulled out a faded photograph, handing it to Evelyn. "This was Anneliese," she said. "A picture taken shortly before she was taken." Evelyn took the photograph, her fingers trembling slightly. It was a different picture than the one in the locket, a more candid shot, capturing Anneliese in a moment of quiet contemplation. She was sitting in a garden, sunlight dappling her face, a book in her lap. Her expression was serene, her eyes filled with a deep, inner strength. Evelyn stared at the photograph, her heart aching with a sense of connection, of shared loss. She felt a kinship with this woman, a bond forged in the crucible of war, a shared commitment to a better world. As she looked at the picture, she noticed something in the background, a detail she hadn't seen before. It was a building, a familiar-looking structure, with a distinctive arched doorway, a unique architectural style. She recognized it instantly. It was the same building where the safe house was located, the very building where she was now sitting. She looked at Madame Dubois, her eyes wide with surprise. This picture," she said. "It was taken here? In this garden?" Madame Dubois nodded. "Yes," she said. "This was Anneliese's home. Before the war. Before everything changed." Evelyn's mind reeled. The safe house, her refuge, her sanctuary, had once been Anneliese's home. The echoes of the past, the whispers of history, seemed to surround her, to envelop her in a tangible sense of connection, of continuity. She had walked in Anneliese's footsteps, slept in her room, breathed the same air. She had found not just a safe house, but a home, a place where the spirit of resistance, of courage, of love, still lived on. She felt a link to her past, and perhaps a path to her future, too. This changes everything. Again. Chapter 14. The Truth Unveiled. The revelation that the safe house had once been Anneliese's home filled Evelyn with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper connection to the fight against the German occupation. She felt as though she were carrying on Annelise's legacy, continuing the work that she had begun, fighting for the same ideals, the same dreams of freedom and justice. She spent her days helping Madame Dubois, assisting with the day-to-day operations of the safe house, providing medical care to injured resistance fighters, passing messages, gathering intelligence. She learned the intricate workings of the underground network, the secret codes, the hidden routes, the clandestine meetings. She also continued to search for information about Davies, about his network, about the remaining threats to the Allied cause. She knew that he was just one piece of a larger puzzle, a single cog in a vast and complex machine of espionage and betrayal. One evening, as she was sorting through a box of old documents, she came across a file, a thick dossier filled with reports, photographs, and coded messages. It was Davies's file, a detailed record of his activities, his contacts, his communications with the German High Command. She began to read, her heart pounding with anticipation. The file contained a wealth of information, confirming Elsie's testimony, revealing the full extent of Davies's treachery. It also contained something else, something that sent a chill down her spine. There was a list of names, a roster of Allied officers, soldiers, and civilians who were suspected of collaborating with the Germans, of providing information to Davies, of aiding his efforts to sabotage the Allied war effort. And at the top of the list, underlined in red, was the name, Captain James Calloway. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Calloway? A collaborator? It couldn't be true. She had trusted him, believed him, fallen in love with him. He had fought bravely, risked his life, helped her to expose Davies. He had told her of Annelise and their love. But there it was, in black and white, his name on Davies's list, a damning piece of evidence that seemed to shatter everything she had believed. She reread the file, searching for any explanation, any mitigating circumstance, any hint of doubt. But the evidence was overwhelming. There were coded messages, intercepted communications, eyewitness accounts, all pointing to Calloway's involvement in Davies's network. She felt a wave of nausea, a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Had she been wrong about him? Had he been playing her all along, manipulating her, using her to achieve his own ends? She remembered his fevered plea, his stolen kiss, his desperate words of love and trust. Were they all lies, a carefully constructed facade to conceal his true allegiance? She had let him in. She had trusted him with it all. She didn't know what to believe. She was torn between her heart, which still clung to the image of the man she had loved, and her mind, which presented her with irrefutable evidence of his betrayal. She knew she had to confront him, to demand answers, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. She had to know, once and for all, where his loyalties truly lay. She decided to return to the field hospital, to face Calloway, to present him with the evidence, to hear his explanation, his defense, his confession. She knew it was a risky move. Calloway might still be dangerous, might have contacts within the hospital, might try to silence her.
But she had to take the chance.
She had to know the truth. She had to find out if the man she loved was a traitor. It would break her heart, but she had to do it. Chapter 15. Between Duty and Desire. Returning to the field hospital felt like stepping back into a nightmare. The constant thrum of anxiety, the ever-present smell of antiseptic and blood, the moans of the wounded, it all brought back the chaos and fear of her previous time there, now amplified by the weight of her suspicions about Calloway. She found him in a private room, a concession to his rank and his injuries, which were slowly healing. He looked stronger, healthier, but his eyes held a weariness that went beyond physical pain. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise, then a warm smile, lighting up his face. "Evelyn," he said, his voice filled with genuine affection. "You're back. I was worried about you." His words, his smile, the tenderness in his gaze, sent a pang of doubt through her. Could this man who seemed to care for her so deeply, be a traitor? Could he have been deceiving her all along? She forced herself to remain calm, to maintain a neutral expression, concealing the turmoil of emotions raging within her. "Captain," she said, her voice formal, almost cold. "We need to talk." She placed the file on the small table beside his bed, the file containing Davies's list, the damning evidence of his alleged collaboration.
"I found this," she said.
"In Davies's papers." He looked at the file, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of apprehension crossing his face. He reached for it, his fingers hesitating, as if reluctant to touch it. What is it?" he asked, his voice losing some of its warmth, replaced by a guarded caution. "It's a list," Evelyn said, her voice unwavering. "A list of collaborators. People who were working with Davies, providing information to the Germans." She opened the file, pointing to his name, underlined in red. "Your name is on it, Captain. At the top of the list." He stared at the page, his face paling, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "No," he whispered. That's impossible. It's a lie." "Is it?" Evelyn asked, her voice challenging him. "Can you explain this? Can you prove your innocence?" He sat up straighter, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a fierce intensity. "Evelyn, I swear to you, I am not a traitor. I would never betray my country, my comrades, you." He recounted his story again, his voice passionate, his words ringing with sincerity. He spoke of Anneliese, of her work with the resistance, of her discovery of Davies's treachery, of her desperate attempt to warn the Allies. He told Evelyn the truth. He explained that Davies had suspected him, had placed him on the list as a precaution, a way to cover his own tracks, to deflect suspicion onto others. He had been framed, set up by the very man he had helped to expose. Davies knew about Anneliese and used Calloway's relationship as a further tool for manipulation. "I know it looks bad, Evelyn," he said, "but you have to believe me. I love you. I would never do anything to hurt you, to betray you." Evelyn listened to his words, her heart torn between doubt and desire. She wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to trust him. But the evidence, the damning list, the weight of suspicion, was too heavy to ignore. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception, any flicker of falsehood. But all she saw was love, pain, and a desperate plea for understanding. Suddenly, she remembered something, a detail from Anneliese's letters, a piece of information that had seemed insignificant before, but now took on a new, crucial meaning. Anneliese had mentioned a code, a secret phrase used to identify trusted members of the resistance, a way to verify their loyalty. It was a phrase that only a true ally would know. She looked at Calloway, her gaze intense. "The Nightingale," she said. "What was their code phrase?" "The one Anneliese used?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He seemed to be struggling to remember, to recall a detail from a distant, painful past. Then, his eyes cleared, a flicker of understanding, of recognition, lighting up his face. "The eagle flies at midnight," he said, his voice clear and steady. Evelyn's heart leaped. It was the correct phrase, the secret code that Anneliese had used. He knew it. He was telling the truth. He was not a traitor. A wave of relief washed over her, a release of tension that left her weak and trembling. She had been wrong, terribly wrong. She had doubted him, suspected him, almost condemned him. She reached out, her hand covering his, her touch conveying the apology she couldn't yet voice. "James," she whispered, I believe you." "I'm so sorry." He squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and forgiveness. "It's all right, Evelyn," he said. "I understand. You had to be sure." The space between duty and desire, between suspicion and trust, had narrowed, finally closing with a shared understanding, a renewed commitment, a love that had survived the ultimate test. The truth, as painful as it had been to uncover, had finally set them free. They had made it through. Together. Chapter 16. The Rendezvous at the River. With Calloway's innocence confirmed, Evelyn felt a surge of renewed determination. Davies was in custody, but his network of spies and collaborators likely remained active, posing a continued threat to the Allied war effort. They needed to dismantle that network to identify and apprehend those who were still working against them. Calloway, drawing on his knowledge of Annalise's work and his own brief, forced interactions with Davies, suggested a plan. He remembered a mention in Annalise's letters of a planned rendezvous, a meeting between Davies and his key contacts, scheduled to take place soon after the Amiens offensive. The rendezvous was to be held at a secluded location along the Aisne River, a place known only to a select few within the German intelligence network. It was a risky proposition, but it offered a chance to capture multiple collaborators in one fell swoop, to deal a significant blow to their operations. Evelyn and Calloway, working with Madame Dubois and the local resistance fighters, devised a strategy. They would use the information from Annalise's letters to pinpoint the exact location of the rendezvous, to ambush the meeting, to capture or eliminate the remaining members of Davies's network. The plan was fraught with danger. They would be outnumbered, outgunned, and operating in enemy-held territory. But the potential reward, the chance to cripple the German espionage efforts, was too great to ignore. They prepared meticulously, gathering weapons, supplies, and intelligence. They studied maps, memorized routes, rehearsed their roles. They knew that any mistake, any hesitation, could cost them their lives. On the eve of the planned rendezvous, they set out, a small band of determined fighters, heading towards the Aisne River. The night was dark, the air cold and damp, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire, a constant reminder of the war that raged around them. They reached the designated location, a secluded bend in the river, hidden by thick trees and undergrowth. They concealed themselves, taking up positions that offered both cover and a clear view of the meeting place. They waited, hours passing in tense anticipation. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows across the riverbank. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the gentle lapping of the water, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. Finally, they saw movement, figures emerging from the shadows, approaching the rendezvous point. They were German officers, accompanied by several civilians, their faces obscured by the darkness, their voices hushed and cautious. Evelyn recognized one of the civilians, a man she had seen before, in the field hospital, a seemingly innocuous supply officer who had always been friendly, helpful, unassuming. He was one of Davies's key contacts, a spy who had been operating under their very noses. The meeting began, the conspirators discussing their plans, exchanging information, plotting their next moves. Evelyn and Calloway, along with the resistance fighters, waited patiently, their fingers tightening on their weapons, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They waited for the signal, a pre-arranged code word that would initiate the ambush. The word was lavender, a tribute to Annalise, a symbol of her courage, her sacrifice, her enduring legacy. Calloway whispered the word, his voice barely audible. Lavender. The attack was swift and brutal. The resistance fighters, skilled in guerrilla warfare, sprang from their hiding places, their weapons blazing. The German officers and their collaborators were caught completely by surprise, their meeting turning into a chaotic scene of gunfire, shouts, and screams. Evelyn, armed with a pistol, fought alongside Calloway, her fear replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a fierce determination to protect her comrades, to avenge Annalise, to strike a blow against the enemy. The battle was short but intense. The resistance fighters, though outnumbered, fought with a ferocity and skill that overwhelmed their opponents. The German officers and their collaborators were killed or captured, their network shattered, their plans thwarted. As the smoke cleared, Evelyn stood beside Calloway, her body bruised and aching, her clothes stained with blood and dirt. But she felt a sense of triumph, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of closure. They had succeeded. They had dismantled Davies's network, avenged Annalise, and struck a blow for freedom. They had faced danger, overcome fear, and emerged victorious. The river ran red, but they had won. Chapter 17. A Farewell Embrace. The aftermath of the ambush at the Aisne River was a blur of activity. The captured collaborators were interrogated, their information meticulously documented, their network further dismantled. The wounded were treated, the dead were buried, and the resistance fighters celebrated their victory, a brief respite from the constant fear and danger of their lives. Evelyn and Calloway, exhausted but exhilarated, found themselves standing on the banks of the river, the scene of their recent triumph. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow over the water, a stark contrast to the darkness and violence of the previous night. "We did it," Evelyn said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We actually did it." Calloway nodded, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. "Annalise would be proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We honored her memory. We avenged her death." Evelyn reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "We did it together," she said. "We couldn't have done it without each other." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. "Evelyn," he said, his voice husky with emotion. I don't know what to say. You saved my life. You believed in me when no one else did. You gave me a reason to fight, a reason to live." She looked at him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "And you, James," she said, "you gave me a purpose, a sense of belonging, a reason to hope. You showed me that even in the darkest of times, love can still bloom, even amidst the ruins of war." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a tender embrace. They stood there for a long moment, lost in each other's arms, the warmth of their bodies a stark contrast to the cold, damp air. But the moment of peace, of shared love, was short-lived. The war raged on, and their duties called them back to the front lines, to the constant struggle for survival, to the uncertain future that lay ahead. Calloway was to be reassigned, his skills as an intelligence officer needed elsewhere. Evelyn, too, would return to her duties as a nurse, tending to the wounded, comforting the dying, fighting to save lives amidst the carnage of war. They knew that this might be their last time together, their last chance to share a moment of intimacy, a fleeting embrace before they were separated by the relentless demands of the conflict. "I don't know when I'll see you again," Calloway said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "But I will never forget you, Evelyn. You will always be in my heart." Evelyn nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "And you, James," she said. "You will always be in mine. No matter what happens, no matter where we are, we will always have this moment, this memory, this love." He leaned down, his lips gently brushing hers, a tender kiss that sealed their bond, a promise of a future that might never be, a farewell embrace that spoke volumes of love, loss, and the enduring power of the human spirit. They parted, their hands lingering, their eyes locked in a final, poignant gaze. Then, they turned and walked away, in opposite directions, back to the war, back to their duties, back to the uncertain future that awaited them. The river flowed on, carrying with it their tears, their hopes, their dreams, their love, a silent witness to their farewell embrace, a symbol of the enduring power of the human spirit, even amidst the ravages of war. They were going their separate ways. But they would never forget. Chapter 18. The Trenches Beckon. Evelyn returned to the field hospital, a different woman from the one who had left it just days before. The experiences she had endured, the dangers she had faced, the love she had found and lost, had changed her, forging her into a stronger, more resilient, more determined individual. The hospital was a scene of controlled chaos, a constant influx of wounded soldiers, a relentless struggle to save lives, to ease suffering, to maintain some semblance of order amidst the carnage of war. The faces of the nurses were strained, the stretchers were stained, and the smell of death permeated everything. She threw herself back into her work, her duties as a nurse, her commitment to caring for the wounded, providing her with a sense of purpose, a distraction from the pain of her separation from Calloway, the uncertainty of his fate. She worked tirelessly, day and night, tending to the broken bodies, comforting the dying, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. She saw firsthand the horrors of war, the devastating impact of the conflict on the lives of young men, their bodies shattered, their spirits broken. She often thought of Calloway, wondering where he was, what he was doing, whether he was safe. She clung to the memory of their farewell embrace, their stolen moments of love, their shared commitment to a better world. One evening, as she was making her rounds, she noticed a new arrival, a young soldier, barely out of his teens, lying on a stretcher, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He had been severely wounded in a recent artillery barrage, his body riddled with shrapnel. She knelt beside him, gently examining his wounds. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and fear. Am I going to die, nurse?" he asked, his voice weak and trembling. Evelyn looked at him, her heart aching with compassion. She couldn't lie to him, couldn't offer him false hope. But she could offer him comfort, a moment of human connection amidst the inhumanity of war. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I promise you, you are not alone. I will stay with you. I will do everything I can to ease your pain." She held his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring. She spoke to him, softly, soothingly, telling him stories, sharing memories, offering him a glimmer of light in the darkness that surrounded him. He listened, his gaze fixed on her face, his grip on her hand tightening. He seemed to find comfort in her presence, in her words, in her unwavering commitment to his care. As the hours passed, his breathing became shallower, his pulse weaker. He was slipping away, his life ebbing away with each passing moment. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a final, poignant gaze. "Thank you, nurse," he whispered, for everything." Then, he closed his eyes, his grip on her hand loosening, his breathing ceasing. He was gone. Evelyn sat there, for a long moment, holding his lifeless hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had witnessed death countless times before, but each loss, each young life extinguished, still affected her deeply. She rose, her body aching with exhaustion, her heart heavy with grief. She had done everything she could, but it hadn't been enough. The war continued to claim its victims, to shatter lives, to leave a trail of broken hearts and unfulfilled dreams. She knew she couldn't give up, couldn't succumb to despair. She had to continue to fight, to care, to offer comfort, to offer hope, to do her part to make the world a little less cruel, a little less unbearable. The trenches beckoned, calling her back to the front lines of human suffering, to the endless cycle of pain and healing, of life and death. She would answer that call, armed with her skills, her compassion, and the enduring memory of a love that had bloomed amidst the ruins of war. She would continue to serve. Chapter 19. The final assault. The air was thick with tension, the anticipation of the impending battle hanging heavy over the field hospital. Rumors of a major Allied offensive, a final push to break through the German lines, had been circulating for days, and now, the signs were unmistakable. The constant rumble of artillery fire had intensified, the flow of wounded soldiers had increased, and the atmosphere was charged with a mixture of fear and excitement. Evelyn moved through the crowded wards, her hands busy, her mind focused on the task at hand. She checked bandages, administered medication, offered words of comfort, and did her best to maintain a sense of calm amidst the growing chaos. She hadn't heard from Calloway since their farewell embrace at the Ain River. She knew he was likely involved in the planned offensive, his intelligence skills crucial to the success of the operation. She worried about him constantly, praying for his safety, clinging to the hope that they would see each other again. As the day wore on, the sounds of battle grew closer, the ground shaking with the force of the explosions, the air filled with the acrid smell of smoke and cordite. The hospital was overflowing with casualties, the wounded arriving in a seemingly endless stream, their bodies broken, their spirits shattered. Evelyn worked tirelessly, alongside the other nurses and doctors, struggling to keep up with the overwhelming demand for their skills. They performed triage, prioritizing the most critical cases, making agonizing decisions about who to treat first, who to save, and who to let go. She saw firsthand the devastating impact of modern warfare, the horrific injuries inflicted by machine guns, artillery shells, and poison gas. She witnessed unimaginable suffering, unbearable pain, and the heartbreaking loss of young lives. In the midst of the chaos, she received a message, a crumpled piece of paper, delivered by a young orderly, his face pale and drawn. It was from Calloway, a brief, hastily scrawled note. Evelyn, it read, "The offensive has begun. I am at the front. Pray for me. I love you.
James."
Her heart pounded in her chest. He was out there, in the thick of the fighting, risking his life for the cause they both believed in. She felt a surge of fear, a desperate longing to be with him, to protect him, to share his fate. But she knew she couldn't. She had her own duties, her own responsibilities. She had to stay here, at the hospital, tending to the wounded, offering comfort, doing her part to support the war effort. She folded the note, carefully placing it in her pocket, close to her heart. It was a tangible link to him, a reminder of their love, their shared commitment, their hope for a future together. As the night wore on, the battle raged with unrelenting fury. The hospital was a scene of organized chaos, a constant struggle to save lives, to ease suffering, to maintain some semblance of order amidst the carnage. Evelyn worked through the night, her body aching with exhaustion, her mind numb with fatigue. She moved mechanically, her hands performing their tasks automatically, her heart heavy with grief and worry. As dawn approached, the sounds of battle began to subside, the intensity of the fighting diminishing. The offensive, it seemed, had reached its climax. The news began to filter in, fragmented reports from the front lines, rumors of victory, of heavy losses, of a hard-fought battle that had pushed the German lines back, but at a terrible cost. Evelyn waited, anxiously, for news of Calloway, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She searched the faces of the newly arrived wounded, hoping to see him, fearing the worst. Finally, she saw him. He was being carried on a stretcher, his face pale, his body covered in blood. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. She rushed to his side, her heart leaping with a mixture of relief and terror. He was alive, but he was badly injured. The final assault had almost claimed him. It was unclear if he would survive. Chapter 20. Scars of Love and War. Evelyn hovered over Calloway, her every sense focused on his fragile hold on life. He had sustained multiple shrapnel wounds, lost a significant amount of blood, and was drifting in and out of consciousness. The surgeons worked tirelessly, removing the shrapnel, repairing the damage, fighting to save his life. She stayed by his side, day and night, holding his hand, whispering words of encouragement, praying for his recovery. She monitored his vital signs, changed his bandages, administered medication, and did everything in her power to ease his pain, to keep him alive. The days blurred into weeks, a constant cycle of hope and despair, of progress and setbacks. Calloway underwent multiple surgeries, fought off infections, and battled his way back from the brink of death. Slowly, gradually, he began to improve. His breathing became stronger, his pulse steadier, his consciousness more frequent and sustained. He started to recognize Evelyn, to respond to her touch, to whisper her name. One afternoon, as she sat beside him, holding his hand, he opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on her face. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of gratitude. "James," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You're awake. You're going to be all right." He smiled weakly, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love. I knew you'd be here," he said. You never gave up on me." "Never," she said, her voice firm. "I will never give up on you." His recovery was slow and arduous, a long and painful journey back to health. He had to relearn how to walk, how to use his hands, how to cope with the physical and emotional scars of war. Evelyn was there for him, every step of the way, providing unwavering support, encouragement, and love. She helped him with his physical therapy. She listened to his fears. She shared his pain. She celebrated his triumphs. As he regained his strength, they talked about the future, about their hopes and dreams, about the life they wanted to build together once the war was over. They spoke of Annalise, of her sacrifice, of her enduring legacy, of their commitment to honoring her memory by creating a better world. The war finally ended, the guns falling silent, the fighting ceasing, the world slowly beginning to heal from the wounds of conflict. Calloway was discharged from the army, his body scarred, his spirit unbroken. He and Evelyn returned to England, to a world that had changed irrevocably, a world scarred by war, but also filled with hope, with resilience, with the promise of a new beginning. They married, in a quiet ceremony, surrounded by friends and family, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope amidst the ruins of war. They built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with shared purpose. They never forgot the sacrifices they had made, the losses they had endured, the lessons they had learned. They carried the scars of war, both visible and invisible, but they also carried the scars of love, a love that had blossomed amidst the chaos and destruction, a love that had sustained them through the darkest of times, a love that would endure forever. The physical and emotional scars, a reminder of all that had been risked and won. They had found peace at last. Epilogue. Years passed, turning into decades. The world changed, healed, and moved on, but Evelyn and James remained steadfast in their love, their bond forged in the crucible of war, tempered by time and experience. They lived a quiet, unassuming life, in a small cottage in the English countryside, surrounded by a garden filled with lavender, a fragrant reminder of Annalise, of their shared past, of the sacrifices they had made. They had children, and then grandchildren, who listened with rapt attention to their stories of the Great War, of the courage, the resilience, the love that had blossomed amidst the ruins. They spoke of Annalise, of Madame Du Bois, of the brave men and women of the resistance, of the horrors they had witnessed, the sacrifices they had made, the lessons they had learned. Evelyn often found herself thinking back to those tumultuous years, to the field hospital, to the safe house in Reims, to the banks of the Aisne River, to the trenches where so many young lives had been lost. She remembered the fear, the pain, the loss, but she also remembered the camaraderie, the courage, the unwavering commitment to a better world. She remembered the stolen moments of love, the whispered promises, the farewell embrace that had sustained her through the darkest of times. She remembered the feeling of James's hand in hers, the warmth of his smile, the unwavering strength of his love. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat together in their garden, surrounded by the vibrant colors of the changing leaves, James took her hand, his touch still gentle, still reassuring, after all these years. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "Do you ever regret it? All of it? The war, the danger, the loss?" She looked at him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "No, James," she said. "Never. I would do it all again. For you. For Annalise. For the world we fought to create." He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, the lines etched by time and experience telling a story of a life well lived, a love that had endured. "And I, Evelyn," he said, "I would do it all again for you." They sat there, in silence, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with a peace that surpassed all understanding. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and purple. As the darkness gathered, Evelyn leaned her head on James's shoulder, her body close to his, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a legacy that would live on, long after they were gone. The lavender swayed gently in the breeze, its fragrance filling the air, a reminder of the pea.